Okay, so my name is Donald Carreira Ching. I am a fiction writer, sometimes editor, and I have been kind of involved with the press for maybe going on around 10 or 11 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. Probably since I first wrote my first short story back in 2009 and got it published and sort of started getting involved with Bamboo Ridge then. In terms of this project itself, I think Ken, if you want to just share a little bit about sort of how this project got started, because he's really the one who kind of got things rolling in regards to this project.
Okay, I started volunteering for Bamboo Ridge in early 2019, and I wasn't aware of many of the major players of Bamboo Ridge. I knew that Daryl and Eric had retired, but then I started meeting some of the other folks, and I said, gosh, these guys are getting kind of old. And so I contacted Craig Howes, because I knew he was this director of the Center for Biographical Research. And I said, what do you think of the idea of having some kind of oral history of Bamboo Ridge? And so he said, great, let's meet over lunch sometime. And he had some other things to deal with, so we didn't actually meet until the end of August. At that point, Maria Hara had passed away, and that added a real sense of urgency to this project. So we talked about it, and we thought it was great. And he said, well, we need to vet it through Bamboo Ridge first. And I said, okay, I'll talk to them about this. And of course, they approved it completely. And Craig said he knew just the guy to kind of coordinate things, Donald Carreira Ching. So we put it all together and started interviewing people in 2022. And then I wrote a grant to the Hawaii Council for Humanities to fund it for this year to do much more extensive work on it. And I want to shout out to Mr. Stacy Hoshino, who's been very helpful in this whole process. And that's where we are today. Okay.
Okay, ooh, and you get me in there now. Okay, thank you, Ken. And yeah, I mean, I think, when Craig came to me about starting the oral history project, I think, one question that I had before, really starting it, and then when I started going through the training is sort of why an oral history project. Oral history projects are unique in that, I usually talk about them in the sense of they're the individual's opportunity to make the history real for them and to document that history. It's quite a bit different from something like, like a magazine interview or something like that. It's really about giving that other person or those other people the chance to put down the story as they want it to be sort of remembered and recorded. And so that's really, really unique in regards to the oral history. And it's also, I think, really relevant because if we're kind of thinking about, local literatures of Hawaii, culture here in Hawaii, that kind of talk story atmosphere of Hawaii, it's just very fitting to an oral history project. And it's very unique in that particular respect. So it kind of really worked out to be kind of the perfect way to join, the project with Bamboo Ridge History, and then also kind of to look at other things. And I should note, in terms of oral history, and this is from the Center for Oral History here at UH, oral history is a method of conducting historical research to record interviews between a narrator with personal experience of historically significant events and well-informed interviewer with the goals of celebrating community knowledge, stories, traditions, and history. And that's what it really is. It's a celebration of the knowledge and stories and traditions. And a lot of the things that are discussed in the oral history, some of it, it's stuff that might be documented, in various interviews, various essays, various stories over the last, 45 years, right? I mean, if we look at just the individuals who are here on the panel today, and the amount of scholarship that's been done by those particular individuals, right, is very well recorded. But the cool thing about having an oral history is that it's all kind of in one place with one of the most important factors, which is not always there in those kinds of publications and things like that, and that's the personal. And so a lot of those kinds of anecdotes about if you kind of walked in while Rob was talking to Steve or getting those kind of side conversations, to me that's kind of the magic of the oral history, is that you get all of these kinds of side conversations and little bits that you would not normally get in kind of a standard interview or a standard publication. And that really helps to bring it to life and to help see a lot of kind of things that you might not normally see. in other ways of doing this. If you're not kind of familiar with the way that an oral history works, this is just a little bit of information about the process and about kind of how this particular project came about. So after I was contacted, I'm also a PhD student at University of Hawaii Manoa. So part of this was, also a part of a PhD project that I did with Craig. What we did was the press, me, Ken, Craig, as well as collaboration with others, create a list of kind of key individuals and a working timeline for the project. And today we'll talk about sort of where the project currently is, but this is really just 1 year in terms of a large, multi-year project that will probably see different kinds of iterations of getting these things published. But we create a key list of individuals, really starting with maybe, the core group, and then thinking about different stages of other people that would get involved with the project, sort of just kind of expanding the scope out. Because one of the main research questions that we're interested in is sort of what is the impacts that Bamboo Ridge has had in terms of local literature and literatures of Hawaii here, but also to get a sense of what the historical, social, cultural context was at the time of Bamboo Ridge's inception. So, that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that there is a focus here on Bamboo Ridge, but there's also this larger focus that's looking at sort of, again, the social, cultural, historical times in which Bamboo Ridge and context in which Bamboo Ridge sort of came about. So a lot of these interviews, like for example, I interviewed Eric Chalk. We did 5 interviews over the course of around 12, 13 hours. A lot of those first interviews, Bamboo Ridge really wasn't even mentioned. It's a lot about sort of the history of UH and sort of what the culture was like at UH at the time, different kinds of ethnic studies movements that were going on at the time. So there's a lot of other things that are happening. Anyway, creating a list of key individuals and a working timeline, then going through logistics, getting everyone trained, including myself, working on creating permission forms, figuring out who the interviewer is going to be, and then figuring out the format. And we were, sort of blessed to be able to have Zoom, because Zoom makes, as everyone will attest to, we have at least 2 people who are the interviewers and are kind of responsible for the transcriptions will attest it's much easier to kind of work with Zoom and have it transcribed for you using its AI than it would be if this was sort of, 10, 20 years ago when you're really just working with tape. Kind of going through training, explaining some of what I kind of already explained in terms of kind of how things are different and how an oral history works. And then kind of from there, it's up to the people who have volunteered to interview the different individuals that are listed. And what they do is I give them a list of sort of just basic questions that they can ask, and then they go and they research the individual and kind of adding to that list and creating their own sort of points of discussion or interests, or just kind of seeing where it takes you. And if you have any kind of questions about that, we have at least 2 panelists on our, well, we do have 2, just us 2 panelists, Susan and Ken, who were interviewers. And we also are lucky enough to have Stephen and Rob, and we'll do formal introductions shortly, who were interviewees, but they can also kind of attest to this process. So if you're interested in that, that's something we can kind of talk about then. And then from there, we kind of do a pre-interview, kind of getting everyone kind of comfortable with everything. And then the actual interview takes place. And sometimes that interview can be just, an hour, but usually it's much longer than that, and it's across multiple sessions. We just completed Kent Sakota and Micheline Sung completed their interview, and it was 4 hours long, that one interview. But it actually ended up being an interview with Kent, and then Kent decided we're going to interview Micheline. So we kind of have both involved there. So it ended up being sort of a joint interview. And then, yeah, so it can go a little bit longer. Some key takeaways so far is really a greater understanding of the historical context. Like I mentioned at the beginning, just getting a sense of sort of how Bamboo Ridge came about because of Talk Story, because of what was going on with Frank Chin and the Asian American movements on the continent, the ethnic study movements that were happening as well. And Rob and Steve can definitely talk about that if you want to hear a little bit more about sort of some of their takeaways there. Also getting a clearer sense of the events and people that were involved, not just directly, but indirectly. Again, some of those kind of side stories. Different kinds of connections and intersections between local literature movement and other movements here in Hawaii, as well as the departures in terms of the kind of timeline of Bamboo Ridge, and then the timeline of when things start to sort of fracture and the tensions that were there. and the impact of the press, both kind of past, present, and future. And we're still trying to sort of fill in those gaps and think about those kinds of things, but that's definitely something that we are working on and working through. In terms of who's been interviewed so far, we've got about, I don't know how many people, I didn't count this, but those are all the individuals that we have interviewed up to this particular point. So Eric, Daryl, the founders of the press. We've also got Mavis Hara, writer who's been involved with the press for many, many years, sister to Marie Hara, Juliet Kono, the previous current editor-in-chief, and a number of other individuals. Steve, noted scholar, involved with the press early on, Dennis Harada, Pat Matsueda, Loisan Yamanaka, Lanning Lee, Gene, Rob Wilson, also noted scholar, Gail Harada, Kent Sakota, Michelin Song, Kathy Song, and Arnold Hura. And then we have Chris Fay as well, but she's kind of pending right now. That interview should be done this week or next week. But we also have, so, you might look at this list and feel like this looks pretty extensive, but this is really only phase 1 and 2 of probably around 5 or 6 phases. There's over 30 more individuals that we have scheduled or going to be scheduled or hoping to interview for this project. And if we're kind of thinking about, if you're wondering like, when can I read these interviews, or what will these interviews sort of look like, or where we'll be able to access them? Well, one way you'll be able to do that is through the Oral History website, and I'm actually going to take us there. If you want to access it yourself, link is in the chat. I'm going to stop share, and then I'm going to take you over there and kind of show you what it looks like, and some of the cool things that you can actually kind of do and see when you are on the Oral History website. Okay. So, gives you a little bit of kind of a history of the project and a sense of, why the project came about. We also have, and so we have 2 transcriptions up, but this is currently, literally we have individuals editing and adding to this website as we speak. We thought for this particular presentation, it was important to have, kind of the founders up. And so we do have, I think, 2 or 3 of Eric's interviews up, and then 2 of 3 of Daryl's. But what's cool is that when you're here, you can click to read the interview transcript. Yeah, we have 2 of 5 of Eric's up. So you get the full sort of transcript as you have it. We've also got these kind of pull quotes you can check out, and then you can actually hear, hold on a second, I got to share with sound. Sorry, I hope I'm not making anyone dizzy with the Zoom. But you can hear.
My father grew up next to the Nuanu Y. Chinatown was not that far away. My grandfather on that side, he used to walk down to Chinatown. My grandfather on my mother's side, when he lived with us for a little while, he used to walk down to Ahala Park when it was like a lot of old Japanese plantation workers and people like that. They used to hang out down there, the men. There was a Toyo theater and lots of Japanese stores down there. Down there, drink beer with the guys at night. So yeah, the neighborhood was, our whole life was all there. It was setting for everything, for at least 2 generations.
Yeah, so, and there'll be more of that as you go, but you actually get sections of the recorded interviews that have been chosen. And because of the oral history process and the approval process and how the transcripts are edited, if you're kind of wondering, can we access the full audio? I mean, the answer to that is no, and that's because, right, it sort of goes through the process of back and forth and making sure everything is sort of as the subject wants it to sort of be recorded. But as much as possible, we're going to try to provide those kinds of audio moments, because it's just great to hear the individual actually kind of talking and speaking. And, I think this particular pull quote emphasizes, something else that's coming out, right? Again, about that cultural and historical and ethnic time, right? About kind of where Eric Chalk lived and grew up and those kinds of things. So you can see that. You have it, I think, for all of them. So this is the first interview with him. We've got the second one there. And then Daryl too. We've got 2 of 3 for Daryl, and kind of check it out if you like. And then again, we have a little bit of Daryl down at the bottom. Where are you at, Daryl? No, he's here somewhere. Maybe it's in the second one. Yeah, there it is. Talking a little bit about the impact of Milton Moriyama's All I Ask Him For Is My Body. So you can definitely check that out. So other things, and again, this is something that we're continuously working on. Because of the importance of, you can see the previous presentation on the oral history project that I did with Craig and in coordination with the Center for Biographical Research at UH Manoa. And this presentation will also be added to the page as well. But because, in terms of the scope of the project, we've got our list of individuals and we're kind of working and collaborating with scholars to add to that list. But it's also really important to hear other stories, and especially your stories in that particular respect. Well, thanks. So you'll see that there's this tool here on the right. So if you have, any stories, any sort of memories, any photos, anything, that's related to Bamboo Ridge or you think would contribute to this project, you can hit the share button here and you'll be able to email us directly for that. To be able to kind of add to that. We're also hoping to add sort of other kind of community collaboration components, but that is what we have right now. And also, if you're interested in, and you also have the first issue there with a little bit, I think this is from a flyer, one of the first flyers for issue number 1. If you're interested in volunteering and you want to get involved, that's always something that we are looking for. Like I said, we have over 54, 55 individuals that we have scheduled. Some of those are done, some we're working on, and that list is probably going to be expanded. So if you'd like to be involved, you'd like to be an interviewer, you'd like to be trained in oral history, just hit the button there on the left to email us and let us know, and we'll be in contact with you to see if we can kind of be involved and go through the process. I mean, I think it's kind of cool because it does, it involves a lot, and Susan and Ken could answer some questions related to that. But if you were interested in doing like an oral history project on your family, or something like that, this is kind of a good place to start. I mean, that's one reason why I also wanted to get involved, is that I'm interested in doing an oral history on my father-in-law. And I had really no idea, like, I kind of thought an oral history was really just kind of you sit down and you just let the person talk. And to some degree it's like that, but there's a lot more preparation and research and training. And then, kind of thinking about the ethics and everything sort of involved. So if that could be sort of a segue to you doing your own oral history later on. So that's kind of cool. And then of course, if you'd like to subscribe or become a Bamboo Ridge donor, you've got the button on the bottom as well to help sort of make this project continue. And again, this is kind of multi-year. We're really looking at probably 5 years, 5 or 6 years. I don't know, it could be longer. I don't want to commit to anything at the moment. But hopefully, in addition to the website itself, where all of the transcripts are free and available to anyone who wants to access them, we're also hoping to put it together into a publication. So, probably after everything, all the final transcripts are done, we'll be looking at those, selecting them, and kind of putting out a larger publication so that it kind of be out there and you can kind of put it on your bookshelf and read and refer to it in that particular way. Okay. And we are already getting some questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. I'm just gonna get there. I think I've only got like one more slide. Hold on. Where are you at? If I close it. Okay. Sorry, hold on a second here. Oh yeah. All right, yeah, I got just 2 more slides and then we'll get to the panel. I know everyone wants to hear from them. No one really wants to hear from me. Sorry, we gotta, when you do this virtual, like me in there, you only can start from the, okay. So yep, interviews are ongoing. Again, over 20 more planned. You've got those interviews and other resources housed on the BR website. And in addition to, we saw one kind of photo of the original kind of Bamboo Ridge issue number 1 there. We're also hoping to add in more media and images, especially as folks reach out to us and we collect more of that information as we go. We really want it to be a community resource and a kind of a community hub, especially because Bamboo Ridge is really all about the community and communities of Hawaii. And then again, kind of future publication being considered. Okay, so that's all from me. Hopefully that gave you a good idea of kind of the project and sort of what's happening and what's been happening. And I appreciate that comment, Michelle. I'll definitely pass that on over to the web designers about the font format and background context. Maybe using a black on white would be better, or white on black. to add a bit more contrast there would help with that. I'll definitely pass that on to them. Okay, so I thought I would get us started with a couple of questions. If you have any questions for our panelists today, please add them to the Q&A or to the chat. I think what we'll do actually first, I don't know, do you folks want to just do a quick introduction? Let's do a roundtable introduction, and then maybe after you introduce yourselves, maybe give us, a quick answer to the first question of what made you decide to participate in the project. Yeah, maybe start with, I don't know, Steve, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I got a message from I guess from you about some project. I think you mentioned Craig Howell's name in it, and it was to be an oral history of Bamboo Ridge. So I was interested just on the face of it, because I think that I was there from the very beginning, or at least the institutional beginning of Bamboo Ridge, because I didn't know all that much about Eric or Daryl's biographies, all their childhood backgrounds like that, which I think I am hearing in a sample that you gave. And that's a very different kind of interview from what I was finally given as an oral history interview, along with Ken, who was the interviewer. Anyway, I consented to that because I wanted to see how the origins of Bamboo Ridge would be reported historically, to make sure that our work in Talk Story and the Talk Story Conference of 1978 was also there, and by way of knowledge and understanding. So that was where I began and agreed to be interviewed. Is that enough? What was the first question again?
If you want, I think you answered. I was gonna ask you could do like a quick introduction to yourself, but I think you gave us that in just that little bit about yourself. Go ahead,
Okay,
go.
yeah. Well, what can I say? I was still a graduate student at University of Washington in a PhD program in English, and I coordinated the National Pacific Northwest Asian American Writers Conference of 1976, and there for a year or two I met a lot of the writers who were mainly at work on the continent in Asian American literature, the people who named the field, who embodied the field of Asian American literature, who themselves were not necessarily teaching in universities. They wanted me to go on to teach in the universities. I coordinated that conference. Arnold Hero was also a graduate student at University of Washington in the English department. He was at the conference, and then together we said, we got to do this in Hawaii too. We ought to have a gathering, and we did. And when we started with Marie Hara on board, we quickly understood that there was no such phrase, no such term as Hawaii's literature. And John Hara, Marie's husband, remarked about that. He said, you guys are talking about Hawaii's literature, but nobody understands what you're talking about, because those two words have never been put together in any sentence by anyone in any power ever until you guys are speaking up now. So you guys got to name yourself something other than Hawaii's literature. So I said, well, how about Talk Story? And that stuck. So that was it. I went on to teaching career and research and teaching anyway thereafter. So that's my intro.
Thank you, Steve. Rob, want to give us and there's just so much to unpack there. So
yeah, I think what I'll say really fits somewhat with Steve, because it goes back to 1976, which was the first day I got my first job after UC Berkeley at UH Manoa English department. But I had been the founding editor of Berkeley Poetry Review in 1974 in Berkeley, and it actually had a local dynamic to it to represent student writing, because Berkeley Poetry Review, no, Occident Journal was aspiring to be the New York Review of Books and publish like essays on Pound and that kind of thing. So Josephine Miles and I swerved it towards the local. And then if you also know stuff like William Carlos Williams, it really was rooted in Patterson and the local. So my predisposition was towards the local. Of course, when I got to Hawaii, it resonated really richly with Asia Pacific Hawaiian local, okay? But the other thing I should say is I was in Berkeley when the Asian American Studies program was starting up, aligned with Third World Studies, and Reagan was tear gassing the place, because I remember choking in a Milton class when Reagan actually dropped tear gas because he didn't want the affiliation of Asian American and Third World. They thought it was like, you know, like, I mean, just, I don't know what, like just like a war movement or something. Anyway, so then when I got over to Hawaii and had to relearn that stuff, but I had a predisposition to be sympathetic to it. And so I kind of knew what was going on, but I had to learn from it all, of course. But I can tell you more about some other things in UH Manoa English or Department of Anguish relation to all of that. I can tell you more about that later. But anyway, that's a little bit about me. So and then I've been up at UC Santa Cruz since 2000, but I had published like 10 poems and 3 essays in Bamboo Ridge over the years from its founding days. And again, I can tell you more about that later. So anyway, that's the start.
The Department of Anguish. I think many interviewees would agree with that sentiment. Susan or Ken, I don't know, either one of you.
Susan, go ahead.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I was interested because Donald, of course, asked, and but I was so excited about interviewing Kathy Song just because I loved her work for so long, so that was kind of one reason I wanted to become involved in the project, but also because Bamboo Ridge has been so generous to writers, and and I guess the first time I became involved in Bamboo Ridge was that I came back here to Hawaii after I finished my MFA in Oregon. And, going through the program in Oregon, I think I was the only Asian there, maybe even the only minority student there. The kind of writing that I was doing was so different from what the other students were doing. And it was really, when I came back, it was really nice to talk to Eric. I mean, he talked to me for a long time. And I want to say his approach to editing the journal was so much like what I think you're talking about with the oral history project. It's like, it is this kind of interaction and love that he has for it, where he spent time to talk to you. If he had questions about the piece that you were submitting, he would talk to you about it, and not just make changes, and tell you later. And so, I think he had a very different and the kind of family, kind of a talk story approach to editing this magazine. So that's why I got involved in the project.
Well, I got involved with the project because it was my idea. So I had to at least do something in it. But my current role at Bamboo Ridge is I'm the grant officer. So I spend a lot of time writing grants to help fund the whole publication. But my longer background is as an academic administrator at the University of Washington, Leeward Community College, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa, from which I retired in 2017. And which led me to the idea of volunteering for Bamboo Ridge. But I didn't come to literature until fairly late in life. My first poem was published in 1986. and my first poem in Bamboo Ridge wasn't published till 1998. And I had a lot of rejections. So I held Bamboo Ridge in fairly high esteem because it was so hard to get published in it. And there were so many wonderful pieces of poetry and stories in there. So I was really excited when I first got my poem published. And I haven't had a lot of success, but I think I've had 7 poems published in Bamboo Ridge. So when I had a chance to volunteer for Bamboo Ridge, I jumped on it, and I really hope that I've made some kind of contribution to it.
Thanks, Ken. I think everyone really speaking to the impact on Bamboo Ridge for them, and their impact on Bamboo Ridge. And I think that kind of symbiotic relationship or something, I don't know, whatever you want to call that, I think is very much, you know, I think it's funny, you know, when I was first started writing as well, I would, you know, Bamboo Ridge was, you know, like sort of the peak for me, you know, that's where I wanted to be. And I just also remember, as Susan was sort of saying, just how generous Eric and Daryl were when I submitted a story to them. And I will be the first to admit that in the past, they used, you know, they have an online system now for submitting work to Bamboo Ridge. But in the past, they used to do, you know, snail mail, you know, self-addressed stamped envelopes kinds of things that you normally do in the past when you were submitting. But I remember submitting a story to them, and then, you know, I was so impatient. I would continuously revise it. And I think I sent them like 10 different versions of the same story before they finally responded. And they said, you know, we want the story, but we've lost track of which one you want to sort of us to publish. So can you just send us the version you want, and then we'll kind of talk about it. And then, you know, they asked me to read at Hawaiʻi Book and Music Festival, and I was just like so nervous. And I just remember right before going on, Eric kind of coming up to me and like, hey, you know, or right after, and he's like, hey, you know, that was good, you know, you should do that more often. I'm like, oh wow, you know, this is so crazy. But I think that was just such like an eye-opening thing, you know, is kind of Bamboo Ridge in your mind, and then Bamboo Ridge in reality, as really being, again, that kind of community-centered, community-focused press. Okay. So maybe that'll kind of lead us to, you know, and I think, you know, Steve, I think everyone's kind of commented a little bit on this, but, you know, in terms of the oral history, maybe if you folks, you know, feel comfortable to kind of talking about like what the experience was like, and if you had any kind of takeaways from it. I know, Steve, you kind of said it was a little bit different, your experience compared to like when you were reading Eric's, or when you saw a little bit of Eric's. I don't know if you want to start us off, maybe.
Well, I learned in the hours that Ken spent interviewing me that, well, I know he explained to me later why this is the case, but you, Donald, you talk about many hours of interviews already logged in, already processed and whatnot with Daryl and Eric. But as I understand it, Ken didn't really, well, you know, study those interviews prior to interviewing me. But on top of that, you're saying that Bamboo Ridge is not much mentioned in those interviews because those interviews were about the biographies of Eric and Daryl. So the origins of that, you might say the institutional origins of Bamboo Ridge Press were not covered anyway. And what surprised me was that so much time had passed that I felt like I was a historical artifact. And if Rob feels the same way, you know, I join him palm to palm that, you know, this is the case. At that time, which is just in the past year, I've been interviewed several times for, you know, projects of recovering the past, you know, that like this oral history project. And so I began talking more and more about the origins of Bamboo Ridge out of the Talk Story project, and somewhat about the milieu that was going on that I noticed in one of the excerpts you showed. Daryl referred to as the Hawaiian Renaissance. Well, we should know a lot more about what the term means, Hawaiian Renaissance, now than we did back then. But we thought that we were part of that kind of a movement. And it was very, very important. And it surprised me also that the oral history project, as far as I could tell in the interview process, was not looking so much at the controversies and the issues that were raised, critical issues that were raised during the time of the founding of Talk Story and Bamboo Ridge, and thereafter in regard to Native Hawaiian sovereignty. That is, to the in conflict. Bamboo Ridge and Talk Story were in conflict with cultural sovereignty that was being asserted by the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. And I took that very, very seriously in the 80s and thereafter. And I think my own learning continued along those lines. But I was wondering all those years whether this controversy and issue was really informing the work of Bamboo Ridge, and or whether Bamboo Ridge had taken a stand as being opposed to Native Hawaiian sovereignty, which I doubt would ever be stated that way, but there was an opposition there. So I just want to bring this up to say that my approach to Bamboo Ridge and its history, and to any other history like this, is what I consider to be a critical one, not by means of giving bad reviews of it, but I look at the issues and the questions raised, and that's very, very important. And this is the kind of work that I always thought that Rob was very, very instrumental in doing too.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to clarify as well that those critical issues are definitely part of the interviews. For example, it's discussed with Eric in, I think, either his third interview or his fourth interview. So that was definitely helping to guide a lot of sort of, and like, for example, with interviews with Dennis Guajarada, that was one reason why we wanted to interview Dennis, right? Because there was some riffs with Talk Story and the Hawaii Writers Conference in the 90s that were really important to document. And there's other individuals who are on, not in this current phase, but in later stages where, some of that discussion will sort of be a part of it if they want them to, right? But I think that's the other thing with the oral history, is we kind of left it more open to the individual in terms of what they wanted to say and what they were comfortable saying and talking about. But yes, absolutely. That is definitely something that we wanted to look at. But of course, it's also, different approaches as well. And I think one thing we can ask kind of Susan and Ken is, and maybe something to talk about when we sort of get to you after Rob provide some details to his question or adds on to what Steve's saying, is kind of, how did you go about your approach of your interview? Because that's the other thing too, right? Is that each interviewer has their own approach to how they want. I provide a basic list of questions, but I'm not providing all of the questions. It's sort of up to the interviewer to kind of, do the research and come up with that list of questions. And also, just to give a little bit more logistics too, because I didn't mention this in the process section, for anyone who's wondering why Ken didn't or Steve didn't look at Daryl and Eric's transcript before the interview, is because we want all of the interviewers and interviewees to sort of be separate and give the history as they remember it. We don't want, Daryl's reading of the history to sort of somehow cloud or pollute like Steve's history in any way. We want those things to sort of be separate, so that one, the intersections will be, if there are intersections or differences or tensions, to be natural and real. And because sometimes what will happen, and we all get that feeling, right? It's also why we don't necessarily do joint interviews. Is we don't want, you to be remembering something and the other person kind of goes, oh, but that's different than how Eric remembered it. And you're like, oh, wait, well, maybe I didn't remember it that way, or, it kind of changes it a bit. So that's just some context for everyone who might be sort of wondering, wanting to provide that. Thank you, Steve. Rob, you want to add on or comment?
Yeah, I can go back to some really early ancient Department of English history, but when I first got to UH, I remember going into the UH Manoa bookstore, and there was actually a course called Native American Literature taught by Joe Backus. And that's actually where I encountered Milton Murayama's self-published book, All I Asking For Is My Body. And I read it. I was absolutely amazed by the language, the pidgin, the absorption of all these Japanese, cultural, political concepts, and the whole structure of it all. So I wrote a little review and I sent it to Bamboo Ridge, and then they liked it a lot. And then they had the smarts to actually send it to Milton, who responded to it, so that was really great. I mean, and then when I got it published there, I remember, I won't say who, but they had a coffee room on the 6th floor of Kuykendall, and I was in there as a, unknown, anything assistant professor. And one of the powers in the department said to me, Rob Wilson, we think publishing in Bamboo Ridge is like slumming with the locals. I don't said slumming with the natives. I said, oh, that's interesting. I knew I wasn't going to stop, but he actually did say that, it was like a Harvard snobbery. And I knew, wow, that's not the right direction, because I actually was more affiliated, or felt like local post-colonial emergences, right? So, but the other thing I should say, when I submitted some poems to Bamboo Ridge, Eric Chalk, to me, had a really good poetic radar, because he would pick one or two that were really on the mark, and I never regretted anything I published there. So, Eric and Daryl were both master's, MA students in literature in English. I mean, so I knew them that way, and I'm sure they suffered a lot, because there was just hostility to that local anything, and they didn't consider it really literature. So that struggle had to be won. And then part of it, of course, was talk story. And I remember even talking to Frank Chin. He took me aside and said, what is this thing about local literature? Are you really interested in it? And he came back to Hawaii several times, and I found him full of life, and kind of always bait you, and like, why do you like it so much? Isn't it interesting? And then, and then of course he gave Maxine Kingston a really hard time. And Maxine she was teaching at Midpac, and then she got a job at UH as an instructor, and she was really affiliated with all of that. So part of Frank's antagonism to Maxine was more like the antagonism to whole talk story mode that Maxine, of course, picked up from, Steve's term and the talk story conference, right? She started to use talk story in All I Asking For Is My Body, and rather Woman Warrior, of course. So, but anyway, so there were great forces for it, but there were a lot of really great, deeply rooted forces against it. So the fact that it's still going strong after 45 years is a real credit, but I agree with Steve totally that the relation to Native Hawaiian literature, and I always try to remind myself, and I've said it in the interview, that Dana Naoni Hall published the Malama Aina issue. They did an issue on George Helm that I think Rodney Morales edited. So it wasn't by any means the dominant note, but in the early 80s, they tried to open some space to it. But I'm not sure it was kind of thick enough or enduring enough. You can't just put it in one special issue and say, that's it, we're done with it. So I agree totally with Steve. It haunts my sleep too, thinking about that, of how do we stay affiliated with Native Hawaiian stuff, and I can, let me just say one little thing, that Vili Haraniko and I published this thing called Inside Out about, Pacific literature and, Native Pacific literatures, and including Hawaii. And Haunani K. Trask, who sometimes can be really hostile and difficult, the late Haunani, she basically told her Hawaiian lit students, you have to read this collection. So she, like Steve, she really was for really good critical cultural criticism, and so I always appreciated that, because there's always like people like, oh, she was against all this other stuff. Well, no, she wanted it really done well and critically, right? So anyway, that's just some context. I think I agree with Steve that these issues and conflicts are really important to articulate because they're enduring too. I mean, yeah, there's Steve's got his hand up. So.
I gotta jump ahead here and also pick up on some things that Rob said. This is like what Rob called the side conversations that are going on. First of all, Maxine Hong Kingston had already published Woman Warrior and used the term which she definitely picked up in Hawaii, teaching at Midpack, talk story. And so when we proposed that we call ourselves talk story, said, hey, it's already validated in American literature because it's already there, and we had fun with the whole thing that way, picking things up where we could. I tried to trademark talk story for us. I went to the bureau in Honolulu where you trademark things, and they looked and they said, it seems to be a common use term, so you can't trademark it. And you know how in Chicago there was a big flap about how some pizza parlor or something tried to trademark aloha, right? So deal, but like that. But anyway, Haunani and I personally had we didn't necessarily remember so clearly, but when we were kids, we kind of grew up together in a certain place, and so our friendship continued on, and the discussions were open. But they, I think there's still a lot of work that can be done to not reconcile, but to come up with a paradigm for how cultural sovereignty of Native Hawaiians, of indigenous people, may work with the galaxy, the solar system, the planetary system of others who have come into that place also. But anyway, I wanted really to say that when Donald mentioned in his first message to me, Craig Howes, and how Craig is the editor of the journal Biography and that whole project, I wanted to say that the founding editor of that journal, Biography, in the 1970s was, I think his name is George Simpson. Is that it? Yeah. And he told me, but kindly, not exactly condescendingly. He said, well, some of you are involved in this movement of having this conference that you're calling Talk Story, but conferences come and go. I mean, after that, there's nothing. There's not even a lingering odor. I mean, it was as if he was talking about a fart. Not even a lingering odor, finally, right? What's important is that if you should have a journal or something like that that continues on. And at that moment, Daryl and Eric came to us in Talk Story and said, hey, we're going to start a journal and call it Bamboo Ridge. And I said, right. And that was part of the whole plan. And we actually had something like a 10-year plan for how we were going to develop this field. And every step was followed, as it turned out, including the founding of a journal that still exists. And within 10 years, Bamboo Ridge was already the oldest continuously running literary journal in Asian Pacific American literature, because others came and went, but Bamboo Ridge kept up. And George Simpson had said, it doesn't matter if you have a conference, you got to have a journal.
Thank you, Steve and Rob. That was fantastic. Susan, Ken, do you want to add anything to I'm not sure what question we're on at this point.
I want to just point out, Rob and Stephen were my third and fourth interviewees, because I'd interviewed earlier Wing Tech Lum and Jean Toyama. And by the time I got to Stephen, I had decided that what was really critical, I think the biographical information was important, and I did Google a lot of what both of them had done, and extremely impressed by their scholarship and their stature in academia. But I felt that once I had some basic facts about, their early childhood, education, etc., it was critical for me to focus in on what their relationship to Bamboo Ridge was and their perspective of the initial start of Bamboo Ridge and its continued history. So that was my perspective in terms of my experience as an interviewer. And I wanted to say, I found all of them, Wing Tech, Jean, Steve, Rob, fascinating. I learned a lot from talking to them.
Susan?
Yeah, well, I started, I had a conversation with Kathy before the recorded interview about an interview that she had done that was in The Forbidden Stitch, which was published by Kalex Books. And the interviewer had asked her, and I hope I'm getting the quote right, but she said something about, and Kathy said, well, writing about Asian stuff, maybe I should, not write so much about Asian stuff. And I asked her about that, and I asked her about that in the interview, and she said, yeah, it was a hard time. I mean, Kathy Song had won the Yale Youngers Poets Award in 1982, which is a really big national award. And then, coming back to Hawaii, and she said, on the mainland, very often you feel this tension of like, you're not Asian enough, you're not writing Asian enough, or you're too Asian and all you write about is Asian stuff, as if that's the only mark of you as a writer. And it's, whereas I think what Bamboo Ridge is, when you're here and you're here in Hawaii and you're part of this community, it's not like you're Asian or, you are a poet, you're a writer that is writing about the place that you live. And, she talked a little bit about that and about the thing with Maxine Hong Kingston, that uproar about her. And I remember reading Maxine Hong Kingston too, when I think the first one I read was Chinamen. And it was just such an amazing book to me because, before that I was, reading the canon, and trying to write like the canon. And so here was someone who was using the language and the people and the culture that she came from. And it was an amazing thing. But I think when you publish nationally sometimes, and you are in this minority, it is like as if you're writing about the total Chinese American experience, which you're not. I mean, that's not an expectation they have of any other kind of writer or someone in the mainstream, and I think what Bamboo Ridge has given us is that we can write about our experience and know that this is just a fragment of the experience. There are many, many other experiences that people have in this place that are valid and that should be given voice. And anyway, I think that was something we talked about, when Kathy and I talked about, and it started with that thing about the, what she had in that really old interview. I think it was from 1988 or something.
Thanks, Susan. We're at 12:01. Yeah, that blew by, didn't it? So I think it's a good maybe place to end. Were you going to say something, Steve? Or you unmuted yourself?
I just wanted to say that there's an issue involving what Susan, part of what you said just now, and that is within Talk Story itself, and this applied to Bamboo Ridge as well, therefore, there was an issue, there's a question as to whether you had to be born and raised in Hawaii to be considered a Hawaii writer, a local writer. So then what happens to the people who came from elsewhere? And here you have the whole cultural wars being started all over again. And it was a real vexing thing to me because of the different ways then that conflicting ways that we were defining and just taking it for granted, not really dealing with the issue of whether you had to be born and raised in Hawaii or whether you could be a writer like Joe Stand or a interested participant like Rob Wilson, you see, to be part of this. And I was on the side of inclusion. There were others in Bamboo Ridge who were on sides of being exclusively born and raised. And that alienated the very people who had gotten them to be poets in the first place. That was hard, still hard for me. It applies to all of America and how you define American, inclusively or exclusively, which means Anglo.
Steve, I just want to thank you for sharpening some really key issues that they haunt me to this day. And you really sharpen them, and it is part of the history of Bamboo Ridge to it embodies it all. And you really, and maybe this oral history project and the book that comes out of it is really a good chance to clarify some of these key issues and conflicts, et cetera, and to stand for just what Steve is talking about: inclusion, emergence, something, like planetary. I mean, anyway, yeah, thanks. This has been a great event for me, so thank you.
Well, I just want to note that it's ironic that, speaking to Stephen's point, that my first poem in Bamboo Ridge was called Katonk. And it was about how I didn't feel like I really fit in here, even though I look like I should.
All right, hold on. I just lost my train of thought in all of this discussion. Oh, I think, maybe as we're sort of concluding, and if you'd like to share your feedback, if you enjoyed this event, if you'd like to see more of these types of events, especially about the oral history project, I did share the link to the survey there. You also get this survey automatically after you leave if you signed up as a participant. But I think that was, I believe it's going to come up, but it might be in Eric's second interview or his third one, which should be published shortly. But, he talked a lot about how the critical discussions were important to the emergence of local literature. That is sort of where you might have been quoting Frank Chin about how that's when sort of, you had to have the literature and then you had to have the criticism, and both were necessary as this thing was sort of becoming something, right? In order for it to sort of have any value, I think is sort of what he was saying. But I think, we're at 12:05. I think good discussion, a lot of things added in. This will be part of the oral history project. You'll see this added to the oral history website. And so this conversation and the questions and all the things that came up will be added to that. If you have any questions, anything that you'd like to add, please let me know using that share function on the oral history website. If you'd like to donate, you can donate there. If you have anything to share or add in, you can do it there. Thank you so much to our panelists, Steve, Susan, Ken, Rob, for all of your time and stories and just amazing work. Thank you to everyone who joined us as well today for your time and for your work. We look forward to seeing you again at the next event. Take care and have a good day.